Before we get into the color replacement tool, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the brush palette. So again, to demonstrate this, it's going to be best to utilize a brand new file. So we're just going to create a brand new blank document. And using the shortcuts I showed you earlier, Control Backspace will fill with white. And I'll grab my paintbrush here. And let's actually open up the brushes palette here. And I'm just going to pull those out by themselves so we can talk about them. And I think I just made it disappear. 1 second. Yep, I docked it. I'm sorry. Here we go. So let's talk about what some of these brush palette options do. So we'll start at the very top, which is brush presets. And again, this is where you can come in and pick a preset and visually see what that preset is going to look like. Okay. So let's pick one that doesn't have a lot of action to it. Let's see. There we go. There's one that doesn't have a lot of movement to it. Has no information. We'll go ahead and turn off smoothing. That way there's absolutely nothing connected to it. Now, you have one major control right here, which is the master diameter. Okay, so you can control how big this paintbrush is going to behave. And I'll go ahead and undo that, Control Z. And we're going to do a lot of that. We're going to try some new brushes, Control Z, try some more, Control Z. So the next area that we want to talk about is the brush tip shape. Now what this is going to do is control some of the information as far as how it's angled. Okay, so if I change this, you notice I get a totally different image than if I was to do it something like this. Okay, let me undo those. And you can squeeze this in, so if you wanted to make it very fine. So if I paint in this direction, I get a fat line. If I paint in this direction, I get a thin line. Okay, that's available to you right there, just by clicking these handles. If you want, you can adjust these numbers. Okay, you definitely do that. If you want to flip that information, okay, this is much easier to see on something like a leaf here, where if you want to flip Y, you notice how it flipped over. I'll increase the spacing here just so it's easier to see. So now they're all pointing up. I flip them over, they're pointing down. Okay, so this is pretty much controlling what does the brush look like. So as I come here and paint, that's what I'm going to get. Okay, and I can flip them on X as well. And again, this controls the angle. All right, pretty standard, pretty easy to understand. Spacing we've already talked about in another lesson, and that is controlling how smooth. Okay, you get a smooth line. If you have some spacing, you get a stamp. Okay, and you can have that off or on. So here's off. It's just going to, depending on how fast I paint. Let me erase these. If I go real fast, I get this. If I get real slow, I get that. Okay, so I do like some spacing. We'll just have a little bit turned on. Now let's talk about shape dynamics. Very, very important, because I am using a Wacom tablet. I'm using a pen. This is now connecting my pen to the pressure. So if I press very lightly, okay, you see I get those. If I press very hard, I get something totally different. So right now my size and my pressure is controlled by this pen itself, the pressure of the pen. Okay, I can also control the tilt with my angle here. So if I angle it across different ways, you see I get different angles on my brush as I paint, which is very useful. And if I want to control the minimum size of my brush, let me go ahead and undo a couple of these steps here. Notice that my minimum diameter is 100% of the brush. If I set this down low, I'm going to get some little ones and some big ones, so I get a mixture. Okay, I can also adjust the roundness. However, I'm not a big fan of tweaking the roundness, just because it does affect the way that my brush stamps out. So I'm just going to set this back out to 0. All right, you can flip these, but you know, those are pretty standard. All right, let's talk about scattering. This is where it starts to get really fun, right? So right now I have, just by turning this on, I hit a scattering of 400%. So what that means is I can come in and I can get a really cool variation. And it's very hard to see with just one color, so we'll play with the colors here in just a second. But I can change my count, right? So I can have just a few to a bunch, and all that is connected right here. So count of 6 per stamp. I'm going to drop down. Every time I stamp it down, I'm going to drop down those. Okay. I can also count that jitter, and I can connect it to my pen. And jitter is essentially just randomize, right? So I can maybe adjust this to my tilt. So if I tilt it one way, I get that. If I tilt it a different way, I get more. Very, very useful. Okay, I'm going to just turn off my count jitter here. We'll just pick about 7. That looks pretty good. Next, we'll talk about texture. Now, if you want, you can have that item pick up one of these textures as it paints. So let me texture each tip here, and we're just going to do a multiply. Let's see what we get there. Oh, that's cool. Okay, and it's just pulling in this texture. Okay, and I can, if I don't texture each tip, what will happen is as I paint this through, I'm going to overall get this texture. If I don't, if I just say texture each tip, then I'm going to get a totally random image because it's going to texture each one of those little brushes. Okay, very, very cool. I'm not a big fan of the texture just because I rather use color. But you have this available to you if you want to use textures. Now, dual brush, we're not going to get into dual brush. We'll probably do that in another kit. This is allowing you to mix a brush with another brush. Okay, so we're not going to get into that, but we will get into color dynamics. So to make this work, let's open up my swatch here, and I'm going to just pick this orange, and for my background, let's go in here and pick yellow. Okay, so I've got orange and yellow, and what I'm going to tell the system to do is give me some foreground and background jitter, and I want this to be controlled by the pen. Okay, so there we go. Now it's going to pick some of the yellow, some of the red, orange, and in between here. Now I'm getting a little bit of this green because of this hue jitter. So if I crank this hue jitter all the way up, I'm going to get the whole rainbow in there. Okay, if I crank it all the way off, I'm only going to get these two colors. So I can probably find some kind of a happy medium in there where I don't get a lot of green, but I still get a little bit of color variation. There we go. That looks really cool. Okay, I can increase my saturation jitter, so I get some that are highly saturated. I can also do the same with brightness. Okay, so if I want to add a little bit of muted color in there, I can definitely go in there and add that. And again, it's just adding some randomness. And I can also adjust my purity. So very quickly here, you can see I've created a really neat looking background element just by adjusting a few of these settings. Now, on other dynamics, you do have the ability to fade out some of these. Okay, and this is much easier seen. Let me just reset my colors here. And I'll just pick yellow again. It's much easier seen, like right here, so you can see right under my brush that there are some that are very faint, and that's because they're being controlled by this opacity jitter. And if you want, just like in my lesson on the brush itself, you can flow the jitter, so you'll have some that will build up very quickly and some that won't build up. Now, these can all be connected to your pen. Okay, my pen I'm using does not have a stylus wheel, but you can buy one that has one. Right, so those are all available to you. Now let's talk about some of these settings that are just on-off settings. Okay, and then we'll move on to the next lesson. So let me turn off my other dynamics, and we'll just leave the color involved here. Okay, if we add noise, all it's going to do is break up that edge a little bit and add a little bit of texture or noise to that. Okay, again with the wet edges, it's going to define the edge much better. Let me turn off my scattering. There we go. That's a little bit easier to see. Let me just pick that orange again. There we go. Much easier to see. Let's get a bigger brush here. So as you can see on that brush, the edge is wet, okay, and you're going to get that from wet edges. So if I turn that off, you get a solid. If I get this turned on, you get a little bit of an edge around there. Airbrush is going to let it build up, okay, and it can have some of that opacity connected back in there. Smoothing is going to smooth out that stroke and that stamp. And then protect texture, if I had this texture turned on, is going to stamp that texture. So if you take a look right here, see how that's stamping that on there? It's going to protect that on each image or each stamp that I have. There we go, just like that. So very useful. You have just a ton of options here, and you're going to find that as we're working, we're going to be creating our own custom textures all the time. Okay, so let's say that we're really happy with the scattering and the color dynamics. Okay, we like this look that we've got going for us. Maybe a little bit smaller brush. Okay, something like this. We're happy with that. We want to save this. Okay, that's no problem. All you have to do is select this brush. Okay, and right up here under the options, we can say New Brush Preset. Okay, and we will call this our scattered leaves color. So now all I have to do is come down here and pick this guy, pick a color. And if I deselect and I pick one of these other brushes, actually let me just fill that in here. All I have to do is come back here, pick that, and I'm good to go. So that's how you can save your brushes. Again, just come out here, and you're going to say New Brush Preset, and you can save it, and it's going to be stuck over here. Now you have tons of them, right? Right here you have basic brushes. We're just going to say Append. Here's the basic brushes. If you want to come down to, let's say, Faux Finishes, Append. Here's a bunch of faux finishes that we can play with. You have access to just tons and tons of cool information here that you can play with and create and make your own and tweak and save your own. Now a shortcut to adding your own brush, okay, so let's say we've taken this guy, we add some shape and so maybe we make a hair brush here. Okay, we like this brush. You can hit this button right here, which is also a preset. So now when I go to my presets, there's mine that I just made. If I hover over it, it'll tell me what the name of it is. What's great is I also have these available on my right click. So if I go all the way down to the bottom of my list, there's my preset that I made. So here's the original. Okay, let me just go ahead and fill this again. And there's the original. And here's my preset. Totally cool. So this is how you can utilize the different tools available to you inside of the brush palette.